Now let's dive into those 8 topics we're going to address this morning that you need to be ready for come December 1. First, I'm going to talk to you really briefly about a new code of ethics. And then I'm going to introduce for you this new animal in real estate called self-represented parties. And then we're going to talk really briefly about the way we have to make disclosures come December 1. And next, I'm going to introduce for you a new guide called the Information Guide. It's a new document that we have to give to consumers. And then RICO's discipline committee is changing somewhat. And I'm going to talk to you about how that discipline committee has been strengthened. And then we're going to talk about something really fun and sometimes controversial, and that is the ability of a seller to share the contents of competing offers. Then I'm going to show you what's required in written agreements come December 1. Written agreements generally being a BRA or a listing agreement with consumers. And then we're going to talk about designated representation. So really quickly, let's start with the Code of Ethics, the new Code of Ethics. The current Code of Ethics under REBA is 11 or 12 pages long. And it's so big because in addition to those aspirational articulating requirements that we must adhere to, there's a whole bunch of principle-based and technical requirements. So when we were consulting with the government, a key ask was to remove all of those principle-based rules and technical requirements from the Code of Ethics and put them into the general regulation or other regulations. And the good news is the government did that. So the new Code of Ethics, guys, 2 pages long, and it speaks only to those articulating requirements that we must comply with, particularly surrounding matters of integrity, quality of service, and conflicts of interest. If you guys want to have a peek at the new code, go to that website that I just showed you a few minutes ago, aria.com/Tresa. There's a link there. Code of Ethics, click on that hyperlink and it'll take you to the new Code of Ethics if you'd like to look at it. Next, we're going to talk about probably the heaviest lift for us come December 1. So here it is. Right now, we know that there's 2 real estate relationships that most consumers enter into with us, and those are clients and customers. When we were meeting with the government, they told us that consumers are oftentimes confused about the differences between being a customer and a client. And I suspect some of you will agree that realtors sometimes get confused about the differences between being a customer and a client. So in an effort to eliminate any gray, to make sure that real estate relationships are crystal clear to consumers, come December 1, there's no such thing as customers any longer. They're gone. Clients remain, but customers are gone altogether. And there's this new term that we must become intimately familiar with, and that's self-represented party. Now, I need to make you aware that self-represented party is not a name change for customer. These are 2 very different things. Customers and self-represented parties, not even the same at all. So let's have a look at how legislation defines an SRP. And it's a real simple definition, and there it is, bullet point number 1. An SRP is simply a party who's not a client of any brokerage. That's easy to understand, right? These are just individuals who are not our clients. Here's the first big thing we need to understand about SRPs. They are not under any type of agreement with a brokerage. That's a big shift from being a customer, isn't it? Because today, we can sign agreements with customers, can't we? But I just let you know that as of December 1, we cannot sign agreements with SRPs. So here's a real life example. You have a buyer client. You're working with a buyer client, and your buyer client wants to purchase a for sale by owner. Well, that for sale by owner is not your client, is she? But today, we may approach that for sale by owner and ask her if she would let us show her property, and if we secure an offer acceptable to her, would she pay us? And more often than not, these FSBOs say yes, don't they? And in order to get paid from that FSBO, we have them sign an agreement, don't we? We have them sign a customer service agreement. But because of general regulation 13.3.1 in Tresa, we are no longer permitted to have SRPs sign any type of agreement. We are not able to collect remuneration directly from SRPs like we can customers. And if that's gray to you at this point, that's okay. We're going to walk through a couple of more slides where I try to make this more clear. So you're probably wondering then, well, what in the world can we do with these SRPs then? The legislation sets that out. And this is bullet point number 3, guys. And this is probably the golden nugget of information you need to take away from this discussion of SRPs. So here's what the legislation says. And this is a 2-step process. Let's look at the first part. The legislation says you can help an individual who chooses to be self-represented. You can help them if the help that you're providing to them, if the assistance that you're providing to them is an actual service to a client of a brokerage. So let me put that into an example. Your brokerage has a property listed for sale, therefore the seller is therefore your client, right? And then there's this buyer out there who, for whatever reason, chooses to be self-represented. And they want to look at this listing that your brokerage has for sale for your seller client. My question is, would you show this self-represented buyer your seller client's property that you have listed for sale? And the answer should be yes. Of course, I'm going to show this SRP buyer my brokerage's client's property, because that in fact is a service to a client of the brokerage. So that's the first part. Any help you offer these SRPs must be a service to a client. But let's take a look at the next part. The next part says any help that you give to the SRP must not cause the SRP to rely on your skill or your judgment. So let's use an example again. Let's use the same example. The SRP buyer who just looked at your brokerage's listing, your seller client's listing, says, hey, Ray, I want to make an offer on this property. Ray, I need you to help me understand what it's worth. Can you give me a list of properties, sold properties, that is comparables, to help me understand current market value? My question is, should you give the SRP buyer those comparables? Does selecting sold listings, truly comparable properties to the subject property, require your skill and judgment? It does, doesn't it? So there's your answer. You could not provide an SRP with comparable listings because selecting those listings, as I mentioned, requires your skill and judgment. And we're going to go through this in a little bit more and use some more examples to try to drive this home for you if you're still not clear. At this point, though, I want to introduce a couple of new documents required in Tresa. The first is called the Information Guide. The Information Guide, however, must be provided to every single real estate consumer in a transaction, not just SRPs. So I'm going to talk more about the Information Guide later in today's presentation. So let's hold that thought about the Information Guide at this point. But let's look at a document that is in fact unique to SRPs. And that document is called the SRP Acknowledgement Form. Now, both the Information Guide and the SRP Acknowledgement Form must be authored by RICO. The legislation says so. So if your brokerage doesn't like the Information Guide, and if they don't like the SRP Acknowledgement Form and how big they are, or the language used in them, you can't create your own custom. AREA will not be responsible for preparing these like they do all those other forms we use. The law says these two forms must be prepared by RICO. So while we're talking about the SRP Acknowledgement Form, let's have a look and see what the legislation says must be on this form. So first, guys, this form is nothing more than a disclosure. It discloses to the individual who chooses to be self-represented that the brokerage, in fact, has a client in connection with this transaction. So let's think of my example again, where this buyer, for whatever reason, wants to be self-represented. and they're looking at a property that you have listed for sale at your brokerage, it's going to say loudly and clearly and very boldly to that SRP buyer, look, we don't owe you any representation. We're not providing you with any services whatsoever. We, in fact, have a client in connection with this transaction, and that client is the seller. Guys, if you're not muted, can you guys mute yourselves? I'm getting a lot of feedback, so if you don't mind, can you mute yourselves? Thank you. The next thing that's on this form, guys, is an explanation to the self-represented party of all of those risks that they are assuming if they choose to be self-represented. This is going to be a laundry list of all the risks that they're agreeing to undertake if they don't want representation. And that's a good thing, isn't it? It's a good thing that these individuals who choose to be self-represented are aware of, are told about, and fully understand the ramifications of the decision that they are making when they choose to go unrepresented, right? It's a good thing that they are told what all these risks are. And it's also a good thing for us, I think. No more are we going to have consumers saying, oh my goodness, I thought I was a client when in fact I was just a customer. They're going to be told when they sign this form, here's the risks of not being a client. The next thing is this form actually describes the type of assistance that the brokerage is permitted to provide. And that's not going to be a laundry list, guys, of the types of help that we can offer to these folks that choose to be self-represented. It's not going to say things like if you're an SRP buyer, the brokerage can show you property offered for sale by the brokerage. It's not going to say the brokerage can provide you a list of home inspectors. The brokerage can provide you a list of lenders. There's no detail to this whatsoever. We've already talked about what this is. Guess what it is? It's that two-step process in the legislation. Right on this form, the SRP is going to be told, look, the brokerage is going to help you. They're going to assist you because that's an actual service to a client of the brokerage, but they're not going to be able to help you in any way that causes them to use your skill or judgment. They're going to be told that right on this form. And then the next one is a recommendation. This form actually recommends to the individual who wants to be self-represented that they seek independent professional advice. So I know we automatically think independent professional advice is legal advice, right? But the form goes further than that. The form is actually going to say something like, we represent a client in connection with this transaction. We owe you no representation whatsoever. You should actually, in fact, consider becoming a client of another real estate brokerage. And so for some of you, I know that's a difficult pill to swallow. Here you've got a buyer who's expressing interest in one of your brokerage's listings. They tell you for whatever reason they want to be self-represented, yet you've got to give them a form that says, go become a client somewhere else. Now, I want to be clear. The legislation doesn't say they have to go get independent professional advice. This is just a recommendation. It's no different than when we recommend to buyers today that they should get a home inspection. We do that, don't we? We tell every buyer you should get a home inspection. And a lot of times those buyers say thanks, but no thanks, don't they? So it's simply a recommendation. It doesn't mean they have to do it. And lastly, the legislation says, once you present this form and review it to the SRP consumer, you've got to ask them to acknowledge it, that is, sign it. And if they sign it, you keep a copy, they get a copy. So here's questions, guys, I get all the time with the self-represented party. The first question is, can I show another brokerage's listing to an individual who wants to be self-represented? So let's think back to that two-step process. What's the first part? The first part is, any assistance that you offer an SRP must be a service to a client of the brokerage. Well, there you've got your answer, don't you? Another brokerage's seller is not your client. Therefore, if a buyer wants to be self-represented, you cannot, in fact, show them another brokerage's listing. Let's jump to number 3. The number 3 question, we'll come back to number 2, but number 3 is designed to try to paint a picture for you of how different we have to treat SRPs as opposed to the way we treat consumers. So let me set the table by elaborating on question number 3. There's a buyer who says they want to be self-represented. For whatever reason, they don't want to be a client. They want to be self-represented. They're going to assume all these risks that we've told them about. And they want to make an offer on your property that you have listed for sale. So my question to you is, as a service to your seller client, do you write the agreement of purchase and sale for the self-represented buyer?
Yeah.
Yes or no? So let's walk through that 2-step process. First part, again, and I know I'm repetitive, but here it is again. Any help you offer to an SRP must be as a service to a client of the brokerage. So far, so good, isn't it? I would argue that drafting an agreement of purchase and sale, making sure it's airtight, making sure that it's bulletproof, is an actual service to the seller client, right? I doubt any of you disagree rather. But let's look at the second part. The second part of that 2-step process that I keep talking about says any help, any assistance must not use your skill or judgment. Well, is selecting conditions and clauses for an agreement of purchase and sale requiring you to use your skill and judgment? It is, isn't it? So there you've got your answer. You should not be drafting agreements of purchase and sale for self-represented buyers because it does use your skill and judgment. And I'm happy to take questions about that in the Q&A section if you have any. So I leave question number 2 to the last because I know at this point, some of you are saying, oh my goodness, there goes a bunch of my buyer's brokerage business. I can't show other listings, other brokerages listings to cold leads any longer. So let me walk you through that. So let me set the table with an example again. A buyer calls about one of your brokerage's listings and the buyer says, oh, that's $300,000 more than my budget will allow, forget about it. But you know, as a practicing realtor, a knowledgeable realtor, that there are in fact 2 other properties currently available for sale in the community that are within that buyer's budget. But they're not listed for sale with your brokerage. They're listed for sale with another brokerage. So remember, this was a cold call on one of your listings. So is this buyer a client of yours? They're not, are they? They were just a cold call. So do you just hang up the phone and say, that's too bad, I can't tell them about that other brokerage's listings? That's not what I would recommend. Here's what we should be doing, guys. We should be trying to create an agency relationship with that buyer. Now, I know that has some of you fearful right now. I know some of you are saying, oh my goodness, I don't like to ask a buyer to sign a buyer representation agreement. I don't like to put a contract before a buyer to sign before I take them out and show them properties. And I bet a lot of you on the call are like that. When I make this presentation in person, the vast majority of people in the room say, you know what, Ray, that's true. I like to build relationships with buyers before I ask them to sign that contract. I like to impress them with my knowledge. I want them to fall in love with me. And then and only then am I going to pull out that BRA. My point here is, guys, agency can be created in other ways other than when buyers sign a BRA. You guys probably should have heard about implied agency, right? How many of you remember the discussion in our registration education about implied agency? Implied agency means you can create agency with consumers by the things you say and the things you do. So I want you to know that we can create agency, and we do it all the time today, probably without even knowing it, by the things we say and do, not just when a consumer signs a BRA, if they're a buyer, for example. So let me walk you through how I'm going to practice this in my business. If a buyer calls about one of my brokerage's listings and it's not a fit, and I want to show them other brokerage's properties, here's what I'm going to say to this cold lead at this point. Hey, Ray, Would you be interested in knowing about other properties that are currently for sale in the neighborhood that are within your budget? And if the buyer is a bona fide, sincere buyer, they're going to say, sure, tell me about them. And then I'm going to say, hey, Ray, would you like me to educate you about market value? That is, would you like me to provide you with a summary of properties that have recently sold in the neighborhood in the last 90 days so you can get a grasp on how the market's behaving? Well, we as realtors know one thing, and that is that buyers love sold data, don't they? So that buyer is going to say, sure, send me that sold data. And then I'm going to say one more thing. I'm going to ask the buyer, Ray, when it comes time to make an offer on a property, when you find a property that you want to purchase, that you fall in love with, are you capable of filling out the contracts yourself? The buyer's going to say, no, that's what I need you for, aren't they? Why did I ask those 3 questions? I am trying to create implied agency, and I just did by the things I said and by the responses I got back from that buyer. But I don't stop there. Here's what I do next. As soon as I hang up the phone, I send the buyer an email. Here's what the email says. Hey, Ray, as per your request, here's a summary of those properties currently available for sale in the community that might be of interest to you. Next paragraph says, hey, Ray, as per your request, here's a summary of properties that have sold in the community in the last 90 days to help you understand current market values. And then I'm going to say one more thing, guys, and this is a tease to some other information that I'm going to share with you later in today's presentation that helps you comply with another part of the law, and that is, hey, Ray, here's a link to some information about real estate that we'll discuss in greater detail when we meet for the first time. So what I'm saying to you guys here is you can create agency other than in writing. We do it all the time today, and maybe sometimes we don't even know we're doing it. Agency is created in other ways other than just in writing. So have those conversations with those cold leads, convert them to clients, and you're free to show another brokerage's listing to an SRP. So let's summarize our discussion of self-represented parties. Remember, as of December 1, there is no such thing as customers any longer. You're either a client of the brokerage or you're a nobody, right? A nobody meaning self-represented. And remember, we can help these self-represented individuals only if it's a service to a client of our own brokerage. But whatever help we give them, whatever assistance we give them, it must not cause them to rely on our skill or judgment. And you'll remember those examples I provided. And you guys now have come to appreciate, I'm sure, that self-represented party is not a sexier name for customer. These have very different ramifications, don't they? And I know in most of my examples, the SRP was a buyer. But remember my FSBO example? Well, FSBOs are in fact self-represented, aren't they? So I mentioned this so that you guys know that sellers can be self-represented or buyers can be self-represented, but you can never have a self-represented buyer and a self-represented seller in the same transaction. Why? Remember what the legislation says. You can help SRPs as a service to a client. Well, if you have a self-represented seller and a self-represented buyer, there's no client, is there? And lastly, remember what I said? We cannot collect remuneration from SRPs like we can customers. Happy to take questions on that at the conclusion. This next part, guys, will be really quick and easy. We have to make disclosures today to consumers under REBA, don't we? And those same disclosures are carried forward into Tresa. But the way we make those disclosures is different. Here, and it's really easy peasy. Here's how it's different. In the case of disclosures, there simply must be prominent placement of the word disclosure. So where do I think we're going to see the word disclosure? At the top of the document and in a big bold font and in a font size that's larger than any other font throughout the rest of the document. And the next part is simple. The disclosure itself must be attention drawing and written in plain language that's easy to understand. So by attention drawing, it can't be surrounded by a bunch of other text. It has to stand out on its own, right? Like think of the seller property information statement. We have sellers fill those out today and they disclose, for example, latent defects on there. Is that latent defect that's disclosed on an SPIS attention drawing? No, it's a tiny little font size and it doesn't jump off the page. So the new legislation says has to be attention drawing. That is, it has to jump off the page, can't be surrounded by a bunch of other text, and it must be written in language that's easy to understand. So if there's a latent disclosure, a latent defects disclosure that the basement leaks every spring in a spring thaw, say that. That didn't sound like an engineer, did it? That was easy to understand language. The basement leaks every spring in a spring thaw. It doesn't need to be any more complicated than that. So the new disclosure requirement is just changing somewhat the way you make them. But I do want to talk to you about the timing of the disclosure of multiple representation. This is a significant change. And in my meetings with the registrar of RICO, he's indicated that this is going to be a laser focus of RICO. So first, let me say, and you guys know this, disclosure requirements for multiple representation are not new. We have to make those disclosures today, don't we? When multiple representation exists, we have to get the written permission of those parties in multiple representation to proceed. We do that today. But here's what's got to be different come December 1. That is the timing of the disclosure of multiple representation. So come December 1, when we know multiple representation has been created, we cannot take any further steps on behalf of any of the clients that find themselves in multiple representation until we've made them aware that it exists and we get the written consent to proceed. So here's how that's so different. Let me use another example. Let's say I list a property for sale today. And let's say my seller says, Ray, I don't want to entertain any offers for 5 days. I don't even want to look at a bullet. Don't even tell me about an offer. There's no conveyance whatsoever. And let's say for this illustration that you and I work in the same brokerage. I just listed that property today. You make an appointment to show it today. And then you call me and you say, Ray, I showed your new listing and the buyer has signed an offer. Now, remember, the seller said they don't want to look at that offer for 5 days from now. And remember, that seller will not entertain a bully. They've signed a seller's direction to that effect. So today under REBA, what is our practice of letting that seller know that we're in multiple representation? I suspect when you go over there 5 days from now, or in my example, when I go over there to the seller's house 5 days from now, I let them know that multiple representation exists 2 minutes before I present the offer, right? I pull out the confirmation of cooperation and representation in advance of the offer, and I show them that multiple representation exists. And then I ask them to sign it. Right? That's our practice today, isn't it? We pull out that confirmation of cooperation and representation at the time of the offer. But that's got to change come December 1. If you brought me an offer and we're working in the same brokerage today and multiple representation exists because you're working with the buyer and I'm working with the seller, even though I can't present that offer for 5 days from now because that's the seller's instructions, I have to go over to that seller today and say, hey, multiple representation exists. Here's the limitations of multiple representation. You'll remember we talked about this when we listed your property for sale, right? They'll say, yep. And I'll say, are you still cool with us proceeding under multiple representation? The seller is going to say yes, and they're going to sign, right? So do you see the difference? The requirements for disclosure aren't new themselves, just the timing is. That's critical, okay? I hope my example helped you there. Let's now advance to our next topic, and that's the information guide. The regulations surrounding the information guide are really simple. Here's what they say. There's only 2 things. 1, we are required to give every single consumer a copy of the information guide. That's the first part. And here's the second part. And explain the contents of the guide to them before we provide any substantial services to them. So get this right out of the way at the earliest practical opportunity. Give them this information guide. Guys, remember that email that I sent to the buyer with the active listings, the sold listings, and then that link I referred to? Here's a link to some information about real estate that we're going to discuss when we meet for the very first time. That link was this information guide. See how easy I got rid of that obligation to give consumers the information guide? See how I did it right away? I satisfied half of my obligation under Tresa by giving the consumer the information guide right away. Now, when we meet, I'm going to have to explain it to them at a very high level, just like we explain every single document and every single transaction to every single consumer at a very high level, don't we? Now, do the regulations here say how you give it to them? No. So the regulations don't say you have to give them a hard copy. The regulations don't say you have to email it to them. The regulations don't say it can't be provided by way of a link. You can give consumers this information guide however you so choose. That's totally up to you. All you got to do is give it to them and review it with them. And remember what I said earlier right off the top, gang? Who's the author of this? Rico. Guys, I don't think you're going to like this guide. It's big. When I saw a draft of this guide, it was 11 pages long. And guess what? That was before the government agreed to allow designated representation here in Ontario. So I think this thing is going to be about 15 pages long. Remember, you've got to give it to them and you've got to review it with them. Now, let me show you next what the legislation says must be in the information guide, okay? So first, the information guide is loaded with information for consumers about all of the benefits of becoming a client. And then it goes on to say, if you do become a client, here's the duties and the obligations that your realtor owes to you, right? And we all know as practicing realtors what those duties and obligations are, so we don't need to discuss them here. And this is a two-way street. This guide also says to the consumers, oh, by the way, you have obligations to the real estate brokerage when you become a client. And we know that, right? When a buyer signs a BRA, they are agreeing to refer all inquiries about any property whatsoever to us, aren't they? They're going to be reminded in the information guide of those types of obligations. And then here it is again, guys. The information guide is going to be loaded with information for those consumers who choose to be self-represented. There is going to be a laundry list of all of those risks that these individuals who choose to be self-represented are agreeing to assume when they go it alone. So do you see the theme here so far? The theme here is information before agreements, information about the real estate relationships that exist when you enter a transaction. The intention of this form is so that consumers, before they get into a transaction, are fully aware and understand the different types of real estate relationships that they can choose from. And remember, you're either a client or you're not. And if you're not, you're self-represented. Now, I know so far that this thing sounds a lot like OREA's working with a realtor, right? Does the OREA working with a realtor not inform consumers about the different real estate relationships? Yes, it does. So the information guide is explaining real estate relationships, but then there's a heck of a lot more. So let's look at bullet point number 5. This guide will talk a lot about what consumers should expect to see and what they should ask about in written agreements with brokerages. So remember what I said, written agreements with brokerages are generally the BRA and the listing agreement, right? So, I think there's going to be a high-level summary of what clauses they should expect to see in these agreements, but a lot more than what we're probably saying to our consumers now. So right now in our agreements, is there termination clauses? No, right? In the OREA standard agreements, the BRA and the listing agreement, there's no termination clause, is there? But this information guide is going to say something like, hey, if you ever want to be able to cancel your agreement with your brokerage for whatever reason, you need to have a conversation with the brokerage about that and let them know. And you need to get your agreement in writing with the brokerage. So if a consumer says, hey, I don't want to enter multiple representation, and if I'm interested in a property that is going to cause multiple representation, I want out of my BRA with you. That's the type of information that's going to be in this guide. And then there's a specific emphasis on remuneration. Remuneration, guys, is the new word in legislation for commission. So here's what I think this thing's going to sound like. Real estate remuneration in the province of Ontario is not a set standard. The amount of remuneration you pay is entirely negotiable between you and your brokerage. So far, so good, right? That's cool. That's what we say today, right? We all know that. But then it's going to go on and say something like, you may wish to ask the real estate brokerage for different remuneration depending on different circumstances. So here's what I think they're going to say. If the real estate brokerage finds itself acting in multiple representation, do you think you should have to pay the full freight? Do you think you should have to pay the full remuneration contracted for, or would you like to pay less? Do you think that the listing brokerage is entitled to the cooperating broker's remuneration if they simply help an SRP? So for example, if the SRP buyer has the agreement of purchase and sale drafted by their lawyer, do you think you're entitled to the cooperating broker's remuneration? This is the kind of stuff, guys, we're going to see in the information guide. Now, let me be clear. Just because this information is provided to consumers, just because consumers ask us for a different remuneration depending on different circumstances, doesn't mean we have to agree. If a consumer says to you, I don't want to pay you the cooperating broker's remuneration if you simply help an SRP, you can say, sorry, I totally expect the full freight. You don't have to agree to a different remuneration. Now, if you want to agree to a different remuneration, you can. The legislation doesn't say you have to. The legislation just says in the information guide, consumers must be provided this type of information. And then lastly, guys, we're going to skip over the next two bullet points because we already talked about the timing of the disclosure of multiple representation. I wanted that on a standalone slide because it's so important. But then the guide ends by saying, if you have a concern in a real estate transaction, first reach out to the real estate brokerage. Or here's how to file a complaint with RICO. When we saw a draft of this info guide, guys, it just said, here's how to make a complaint with RICO. And at RIA, we said, no, you know what? Let's advise consumers that they should reach out to the brokerage first. And as a broker of record, I appreciate that opportunity. Like just the other day, a guy walks into my office. He was some ticked off at one of my agents. One of my agents submitted an offer on his behalf in a multiple offer situation. So the buyer came in saying something went wrong. I didn't get the property. I don't like it. Something's not right. And I said, well, explain it to me. He said, well, I was one of 12 offers. I'm like, oh, yeah. What do you think went wrong then? The seller had to deal with one. And he said, well, I didn't get a counter offer. The last time I bought a house, I got a counter offer. And this gentleman fully believed he was entitled to a counter offer because that's what happened in his last transaction. So I explained to him, sir, if everybody's entitled to a counter offer when they're a buyer and every one of those buyers gets a counter and every one of those buyers accepts the counter offer, the seller sold their house 12 times. Then he understood, right? He then understood. That saved me dealing with a complaint at the regulator by hearing that guy out. So I'm happy that the info guide says, you know, talk to the brokerage management first. Now, I know you guys all want to see the info guide. So do I. But remember who I said is the author of it, the Real Estate Council of Ontario. They haven't released it yet. So stay tuned to your emails from the Real Estate Council of Ontario, because one of these days they're going to show us it in its entirety. And we better familiarize ourselves with it right away so that when we walk consumers through it, we know what we're doing. Next topic is the Discipline Committee. This will be quick, guys. So currently, only the registrar at RICO himself can suspend, revoke, or apply conditions to your registration. Only the registrar himself. The Discipline Committee today, if they find you negligent of behavior, they can issue a monetary penalty against you, but that's it. However, come December 1, the Discipline Committee itself receive some of that same authority that the registrar himself has. The discipline committee will also be able to suspend, revoke, or apply conditions to your registration. Next, currently the composition of the RICO Discipline Committee is only 3 members. As of December 1, that increases to 5 or more. And always, 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 one of those 5 must never have any connection whatsoever to the real estate industry. That is, they've never been a realtor, they're not married to a realtor, their parents aren't realtors, kids aren't realtors, what have you. And then lastly, one more change. Right now, if you're found negligent by RICO's Discipline Committee, you can appeal. But your appeal is heard by the RICO Appeals Committee. Come December 1, there's separation of church and state. Appeals will now be heard by an independent quasi-judicial tribunal, which is the province's licenses appeal tribunal. And as I mentioned, Tresa beefs up the regulator's strength a bit, so they have some new power and tools. So right now, the regulator can only refer a matter to the discipline committee for review if there's a formal written complaint. As of December 1, that's going to change. The regulator will be able to launch complaints, launch investigations in the absence of a formal complaint. So here's why that's a good thing. A couple of years ago, there was a complaint filed against an agent in my brokerage. My agent was the listing agent. On the MLS feature sheet, in the inclusion section, he said fridge, stove, washer, dryer, pool table, bar, stools, a whole laundry list of things. We received an APS from a buyer's agent, and the chattels included section of the APS was blank. Buyer moves in. Guess what chattels was left behind by the seller? None. The APS was blank in the chattels included section, right? Buyer files a complaint with the regulator, said that our MLS feature sheet, and in particular, the inclusion section, was false and misleading advertising. And that the buyer's agent told them that they didn't have to itemize the chattels because they were on the MLS feature sheet. Now, we all know that the MLS feature sheet is simply an ad. The APS is the contract. So my guy didn't do anything wrong. So we responded to RICO and said, look, this isn't our problem. The chattels included on the APS was blank. This is a problem for the buyer's agent. Go talk to the buyer's agent. RICO couldn't. Why? No formal complaint. December 1, RICO gets that same complaint. They don't come knocking on my door. They go knocking on the buyer's agent's door. So there's an example of how this is different. And then, guys, I'm sure you've looked up your name on the RICO website before. You see your name as registered with your brokerage, right? Or registered with RICO, rather. And then you see the name of your brokerage and the address of the brokerage's headquarters, right? As of, and if you've ever been found negligent of a discipline committee hearing, the hearing results are posted there. Come December 1, in addition to those things, if you've ever had your registration suspended, revoked, or had conditions applied to it, that's going to be there. And I think you're also going to see your expiry date of your registration on there as well. And lastly, this one's for brokers of record. Come December 1, RICO can reach out to us and ask us for transactional data. That is, how many transactions have you guys participated in the last 12 months? How many involved multiple rep? How many times did you assist SRPs? What have you? And because the law says we got to give the registrar that information, we've got to turn it over. Here's the one, guys, that's always fun and sometimes controversial. So we know that when there's multiple offers, when there's a bidding war on a listing, our obligation is that we have to tell every buyer who submitted an offer in writing the number of offers, right? That obligation is carried into Tresa. That doesn't change. But here's what does change. Come December 1, the barrier to open offers is removed. By that, I mean the law will allow a seller to instruct the listing brokerage to share the contents of competing offers with other buyers. But here's the thing, guys, that you need to know. There's no rules here. There's no rules to this game. The seller doesn't have to decide when they list a property for sale, or not later than when offers are presented, whether or not they're going to share the contents of offers. They don't have to tell you. There's no rule that says they have to tell you. So imagine this. I have a property listed for sale. I tell you, when you bring an offer as a buyer's agent that there's 10 offers submitted. And you say to me, Ray, is the seller going to share the contents of these competing offers? And I say, nope, she said she's not. So you and your buyer proceed on that basis. So I present all 10 offers. And then when I'm done, the seller says to me, Ray, I want you to tell everybody that the best offer on the table was $2 million. But remember, I told you that the seller wasn't going to share the contents of offers, and now she is. Did I do anything wrong? No. There's no rules here in the legislation. Did the seller do anything wrong? Again, no, there's no rules. So here's what we got to do, guys, when we're working with buyers. I think we need to make buyers aware of this new process. And I think we have to ask buyers this question. I think we need to say to buyers, how would you feel if the seller decided to share the terms of your offer with other buyers? That's the question. How would you feel about this? And I think some buyers are going to say, you know what? If that's what the seller wants to do to try to sell their property, and that's the rules that they're going to play by, I'm just going to roll the dice, put my best foot forward, and see how things go. But I also think you're going to have other buyers who say, heck no, I don't want anybody to know the terms of my offer. I don't want other buyers to know my proposed purchase price in an effort to try to be able to outbid me. I'm sure you guys agree that there'll be both types of buyers. So if you do in fact have a buyer who's totally opposed to the sharing of the contents of their offer, AREA has created one new clause this year, just one. And here's what it says. In the event that the seller shares the contents of my offer, I have the ability to revoke my offer. Right? That puts pressure on the seller to not, in fact, disclose the terms of that buyer's offer with that clause in it. And I know some of you are thinking, well, Ray, how's that possible? When a seller signs an offer under seal, when a buyer signs an offer under seal, they're agreeing that they can't revoke their offer once it becomes property of the seller. And you're right in the absence of that clause. AREA's legal counsel, some brilliant minds in the real estate legal business have said, Ray, yes, in fact, this clause does supersede the importance of signing under seal. So there you've got it. If you're working with a buyer who doesn't want the terms of their offer shared, there's a clause that AREA is introducing for your buyer's consideration. Now, while there's no rules surrounding whether or not a seller has to tell you what strategy they're going to execute, there's 3 ground rules with the information. So first, it's this. If a seller directs you to disclose the terms of an offer or offers, everybody who made an offer must receive the same information. So if there's 10 buyers who submitted an offer, the seller can't say, I only want to tell these 5, the other 5 I didn't like whatsoever. Everybody who submits an offer must receive the same information. The next rule is that it's entirely up to the seller what information they disclose. It can be as little or as much as the seller wants. The legislation doesn't say it can only be the price and the closing date. The legislation says it's entirely up to the seller. It can be as little or as much as the seller wants. And here's the rule number 3. The only disclosure that can't be made is information that would reveal the personal identity of the buyer. Buyer's name, clearly. And if the buyer had a home to sell, disclosing the address of the home that has to be sold would allow us to figure out who that buyer is, right? So there's the new open offer process in a nutshell. Now, I'm going to ask you guys to all type something in the chat for me. And this is really critical so that you don't find yourself in hot water with the regulator. Let's say, using my same example, I tell you as a buyer's agent, you're one of 9 offers. There's a total of 10 offers for your consideration, or for the seller's consideration, right? The seller has 10 offers to consider. 3 of those 10 offers have that revocation clause that I just introduced to you. 3 of the 10 have that clause that makes the offer null and void. How many offers are there for the seller's consideration? So just type in the chat, guys, your answer. How many offers are there for the seller's consideration? So I'm seeing a lot of 7s, and thankfully I'm seeing a lot more of 10s. And the right answer, guys, is 10. There are, in fact, 10 offers. Just because 3 of the offers have a clause doesn't mean the seller's disclosed anything yet, right? And it gets crazier. Brace yourselves. I hope you're sitting down for the next thing I'm going to tell you. Just because that clause is in an agreement and the seller shares those terms with somebody else doesn't yet mean the offer is null and void. The only way that offer becomes null and void is if the seller, in fact, accepts it and signs it, right? Just because there's a clause in an agreement, it doesn't become an agreement until when? Both parties sign it, right? Now, I know that sounds absurd that a seller would sign an agreement that is just nullifying it. But I introduced this absurd example because I don't want you to get multiple offers. Some of them have that revocation clause, and then you tell people that the number of offers for the seller's consideration is incorrect. Guys, there's a RICO discipline case out there where there were 12 offers at presentation time. And then after the presentation started, a 13th offer rolled in. And the listing agent said, you know what, I'm not going to stop the process. I'm not going to tell everybody that there's a 13th offer. They already know there's 12. What difference does one make? They didn't update the number of offers from 12 to 13. Somebody found out, somebody complained to RICO, and that realtor was harshly disciplined for not updating the process. So be very, very, very careful if you have clients using this clause or you see this clause in agreements for your sellers. Okay. Let's quickly review what's new when it comes to written agreements with our consumers. That is the BRA and the listing agreement. So here's what the legislation says. Any written agreement must comprehensively and prominently set out the following. In the case of a listing agreement, remuneration payable to any other brokerage. I know what you guys are thinking. Yes, Ray, the standard listing agreement from ARIA already does that. There's 2 blanks, 1 blank for the total remuneration and 1 blank for the portion of that total remuneration that you're going to give to cooperating brokers. Here's what the government is aiming at. You can't fill in the total remuneration blank, return to your office, and then fill in the blank. The decision as to the size of the total remuneration is not yours. It's not mine. It's not the realtors. It's not the brokerages. It's the sellers. So here's how the conversation should shake down with your sellers. If they agree to pay you 4 apples for your services, you need to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, of those 4 apples, how many do you want to offer to a cooperating broker? You can give them your recommendation so that the listing is competitive on MLS, but it's their decision. If you don't like the size that they're offering on the cooperating brokerage, you can walk away from the listing, I guess, but it's their decision. Don't take these agreements back to your office and fill in the cooperating broker's commission. It's the seller's decision. That's the spirit of this piece. The next is, and we already talked about circumstances in which remuneration might change, right? If you simply help an SRP, if you enter into multiple rep, it can't be a verbal, it can't be a handshake, it can't be in an email. If you agree to different remuneration in different circumstances, got to be in the agreement. Next, we all know that our clients have to initial the expiry date if it's 6 months or greater, right? Come December 1, those expiry dates have to be initialed no matter their term. 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, they got to be initialed. So just initial that expiry every single time. And lastly, there can only be 1 expiry date in a listing. And some of you are thinking, well, there always is only 1 expiry date. But there have been cases where some people have put in as the expiry date 90 days after uploaded to the MLS or something like that. No, it's got to be a definite date, 1 date, full stop, that's it. Next, we're going to end before we jump into Q&A by talking about designated representation. And if I told you I was ecstatic that the government of Ontario is going to allow designated representation in Ontario, it would be the understatement of the century. So here's what designated representation is, if this is new to you. Designated representation will allow a real estate brokerage with more than one client in the same trade to designate a different agent in that trade to fully advocate for and represent the clients without the limitations of multiple representation. So let me give you an example. Let's say, again, you and I work in the same real estate brokerage. I list a property for sale on behalf of the brokerage. You're working with a buyer who signs an offer on the brokerage's listing. What do we have? We have designated representation, don't we? And what happens in designated representation? The services that we can offer to those clients are limited, aren't they? So if you're working with the buyer in multiple rep and that buyer says to you, what should I offer? You can't answer that, can you? Because in multiple representation, you have to be impartial. You can't favor one client's interests over the other, can you? So if you're unfamiliar or you would like a refresher of the limitations of multiple representation, I'll show you where to find it. See that blue rectangle on the screen with the bolded heading multiple rep? That's directly from the confirmation of cooperation and representation. I think it would be a good exercise for all of us to go back and refresh our memories as to what the limitations of multiple rep are. Here's how designated representation removes those limitations. Again, you and I are working in the same real estate brokerage. And I list a property for sale for the brokerage. And again, you're working with a buyer who submits an offer. If you, in fact, are practicing designated representation because that's what the clients want, I am appointed the only agent for the seller. The rest of you within the brokerage are no longer agents for the seller. You have to remain impartial to that seller. On the other hand, if you're working with the buyer who signs an offer, you on the BRA are appointed the designated agent for the buyer. You fully advocate for and represent the buyer. The rest of us in the brokerage, we have nothing to do with that buyer anymore. Under brokerage representation today, when one of us lists a property for sale, we're all deemed to be considered representatives of the seller, right? Come December 1, if you practice designated rep, we're no longer all representatives of the seller under a listing agreement or the buyer under a BRA. So if you're the appointed designated representative of a buyer and the buyer says to you, Ray, how much should I offer? The gloves are off. You can answer that question. That's at a real high level of how designated representation works. But guess what? It gets better. We achieved the best of both worlds here in Ontario. At AREA, we lobbied the provincial government for consumer choice. By that, I mean, if multiple representation happens to occur, we can still do that too. In Alberta, for example, the brokerage has to be entirely designated rep or entirely common law agency or brokerage representation. In Ontario, it's decided on a transaction by transaction basis. So imagine this. This is where multiple representation works. I list a property for sale for people that I've worked with for years. I've sold lots of properties for them. And then a buyer approaches me to buy the property. And the buyer happens to be a past client of mine too, or my mother, my father, my sister, whatever. I can still act for the seller and the buyer as under multiple representation, assuming I tell them both about the limitations of multiple representation, and they both sign off and agree to it. So in cases where the consumers want the same agent to act on the same transaction, we can still do that. All right. So let me really quickly summarize what we talked about today, and then we've got some time, good, for Q&A. Remember the date of December 1, that is the drop dead date. And remember, if you guys want to look at that new code of ethics, I showed you the website. The most important thing to remember is that as December 1, there are no more customers in real estate. Gone. You're either a client or you're self-represented. And if you are self-represented, we'll help you. But the only kind of help we're going to give you is if it's an actual benefit to our client. And whatever help we give you doesn't cause us to use our skill or our judgment. And if somebody chooses to proceed and assume all those risks of self-representation, we've got to give them that self-represented party acknowledgement form. And then remember when we talked about the new way to make disclosures, easy peasy, prominent placement of the word disclosure. The disclosure itself must jump off the page and easy to understand. Everybody in a real estate transaction, every consumer must be presented a copy of the info guide and we must explain it to them. And then remember when we talked about how the barrier to open offers is removed come December 1. Don't practice any of these things until December 1. Okay. And remember that website I illustrated right off the top? There it is again. The reason I'm emphasizing this again is because it's your one-stop shop for all things Tresa. Here's what we've got on there. We've got 20 or 25 videos that we call Tresa in 2. Myself and 2 of the other instructors on this file are recorded talking about all of these topics we talked about today in 2 minutes or less. So if you want a real down and dirty refresher on some of the topics, go to aria.com/Tresa, check out our video series called Tresa in 2. As we get questions across the province, we answer those questions on our website under the section called FAQ. And here's my favorite part. At the bottom of this website, there's a reach out section. You can put in your name, your email address, what real estate board you're from, and ask us a question. And I'm the one that's responsible for answering all those questions. So if you guys pose a question, you'll get a response from me. So the conversation can continue. If there's something you're uneasy about, uncomfortable about, don't get answered today, reach out because we're here to help.